In June of 1215, on a broad meadow beside the River Thames, the King of England found himself surrounded by men who no longer trusted his word. The place was called Runnymede. It was not a palace, not a cathedral, and not a battlefield, yet it carried the tension of all three. Royal tents stood beneath a grey English sky. Across the grass, armed barons waited with their knights and retainers. Churchmen moved carefully between the two camps, carrying proposals, objections, and warnings. Scribes prepared parchment, sharpened quills, and mixed dark ink. Somewhere near the royal party, wax was being made ready for the king's great seal. Every person present understood that the meeting might end in agreement, but everyone also knew that a single insult, a rumor of betrayal, or the movement of armed men could turn the meadow into a killing ground. At the center of the crisis stood King John, ruler of England, Lord of Ireland, Duke of Aquitaine, and the youngest son of one of the most powerful monarchs in Europe. He had inherited a kingdom supported by ancient custom, royal courts, castles, sheriffs, soldiers, and the authority of the crown. Yet, on that summer day, he faced a demand almost unthinkable to a medieval ruler. His own subjects wanted him to accept, in writing, that his power had limits. They wanted rules that would restrain his officials, protect their property, regulate his financial demands, and prevent him from punishing people merely because he wished it. They did not come to Runnymede as modern democrats. They did not represent every man and woman in England. Many were wealthy lords defending their own privileges. But they had reached a conclusion that threatened the foundations of John's kingship. Promises from the king were worthless unless there was a way to force him to keep them. The document that emerged from their confrontation would later become known as Magna Carta, the Great Charter. It would be praised as a foundation of liberty, misunderstood as the birth certificate of democracy, and invoked across centuries by lawyers, rebels, politicians, and ordinary citizens. But in 1215, it was not yet a sacred symbol. It was a desperate peace agreement between a king and men prepared to make war against him. John did not arrive at Runnymede intending to create freedom. He came because London had fallen into rebel hands, because his barons had renounced their loyalty, because his military plans had failed, and because the authority he believed absolute was collapsing around him. How had it come to this? How had a prince raised in the greatest royal family of his age become a king so feared and distrusted that his own nobles forced him into a meadow at sword point? Why did he accept the charter? And why did he try almost immediately to destroy it? To understand the king who was forced to admit that no ruler could stand entirely above the law, we must return to the beginning, to a child who was never expected to inherit the throne. John was born in 1166 or 1167, the youngest surviving son of King Henry II and Eleanor of Aquitaine. His parents ruled over an extraordinary collection of territories stretching from the borders of Scotland deep into what is now France. This was not a single, neatly unified empire with one language and one system of government. It was a web of kingdoms, duchies, counties, family claims, marriages, and personal loyalties held together by the energy of Henry and the prestige of his dynasty. The royal household into which John was born was magnificent, restless, and dangerous. His father was one of the most formidable rulers of the 12th century, a man who traveled constantly, heard legal disputes, directed armies, and expected obedience. His mother was wealthy, politically experienced, and famous across Europe. John's older brothers appeared to possess clear places in the family order. Henry, known as the young king, had already been crowned during his father's lifetime. Richard was associated with Aquitaine and would become celebrated as Richard the Lionheart. Geoffrey was linked to Brittany through marriage. John, the youngest, seemed to have no great inheritance waiting for him. According to tradition, his father jokingly called him Lackland because there was no obvious territory left to give him. The name would cling to John long after childhood, becoming one of history's cruelest ironies. The prince, who seemed destined to inherit nothing, would one day receive almost everything and then lose much of it. Life among the Plantagenets taught John lessons that were useful for survival, but destructive for trust. Royal families were not gentle households. Brothers competed for land. Sons rebelled against fathers. A mother might support one child against another. Promises of castles and titles could be withdrawn when political circumstances changed. Marriage was a weapon of diplomacy. Affection mattered, but power mattered more. John watched his father struggle against rebellions led by his older sons. He learned that loyalty could be performed in public and betrayed in private. He learned that a man who appeared obedient today might join an enemy tomorrow. These lessons did not make John uniquely wicked, but they helped shape a ruler who rarely trusted anyone completely and inspired little trust in return. Henry attempted to provide for his youngest son by arranging lands, income, and a marriage, but every gift threatened someone else's expectations. When John was still young, proposals to give him castles contributed to tension within the royal family. Later, Henry made him Lord of Ireland and sent him across the Irish Sea in 1185. The expedition should have introduced John as a powerful royal governor. Instead, it became an early demonstration of his weaknesses. Chroniclers hostile to him claimed that he mocked the clothing or appearance of Irish leaders and alienated men whose cooperation he needed. Some of these reports may have been exaggerated, but the political result was real. The mission failed to establish the authority John and his father had hoped for. He returned to England with little glory. Failure did not teach him patience. It deepened his desire to prove himself. When Henry II's family conflicts reached their final crisis, John's behavior added another wound. Richard rebelled against their father with support from the French king. Henry, already ill and exhausted, discovered that John, the son he had favored and tried to protect, had also joined the opposing side. Henry died in 1189, reportedly heartbroken by the betrayal. Richard became king. John was no longer the neglected youngest child. He was now the brother of a warrior king who intended to leave England for crusade. Richard's absence created opportunity. Although Richard attempted to limit John's influence, John maneuvered for position while the king was abroad and later imprisoned on his journey home. He negotiated, made alliances, and at times appeared willing to benefit from his brother's captivity. Yet Richard eventually returned, defeated his rivals, and forgave John with a remark suggesting that his younger brother had been led astray. The forgiveness was politically convenient, but it did not erase John's reputation for opportunism. Then, in 1199, Richard was struck by a crossbow bolt while besieging a castle in France. The wound became infected. The Lionheart died without a legitimate child. Suddenly, the prince once called Lackland stood close to the greatest inheritance in Western Europe. But the succession was not simple. Some believed the crown should pass to John as Henry II's surviving son. Others supported Arthur of Brittany, the young son of John's deceased older brother Geoffrey. Medieval inheritance rules were not uniform enough to settle the issue automatically. The question would be answered by power, alliances, and war. John moved quickly. He secured support in England and was crowned at Westminster in May 1199. The ceremony declared him king, but it could not erase his rival. Arthur's claim found support among nobles in Brittany, Anjou, and elsewhere on the continent. The dispute was particularly dangerous because the English king was also a great French lord. For his territories in France, John owed feudal obligations to Philip II, King of France. Philip was no passive observer. He was intelligent, patient, and determined to reduce Plantagenet power. He could recognize John as the rightful holder of certain lands, challenge him in others, support Arthur, or use legal procedure as a weapon against him. John needed to hold together barons whose estates might lie on both sides of the Channel and whose loyalty depended on their belief that he could protect them. At first, John appeared capable of doing so. He made agreements, campaigned successfully, and captured Arthur in 1202. The young rival was taken into John's custody. Then Arthur disappeared. What happened remains uncertain. Later stories accused John of murdering his nephew personally, perhaps in a fit of anger, and throwing the body into a river. Other accounts offered different details. There is no surviving evidence that allows the exact event to be reconstructed with confidence. But in politics, the belief that a crime has occurred can be almost as destructive as proof. Arthur was last known to be John's prisoner. He vanished, and John could not provide an explanation that restored confidence. Nobles who had supported Arthur saw the disappearance as evidence that John could eliminate a rival without lawful judgment. Even men who did not care deeply about Arthur could wonder what such a king might do to them. The crisis damaged John at precisely the moment when Philip of France was applying pressure. A feudal law provided Philip with an opportunity. John was summoned to answer complaints before the French royal court. When he failed to appear in a manner Philip accepted, the French king declared John's continental fiefs forfeited. Legal language now gave cover to military conquest. Philip's armies advanced. Castles surrendered or were captured. Local lords changed sides when they concluded John could no longer defend them. The most painful loss was Normandy. Since the Norman conquest of 1066, England and Normandy had been bound together by dynastic rule and aristocratic landholding. Many nobles possessed estates in both regions. The Channel was not simply a border, it was a road connecting parts of the same political world. In 1204, that world broke apart. Normandy fell to Philip. Anjou and other territories were also lost. John retained England, Ireland, and lands in southwestern France. But the great inheritance he had received from Richard had shrunk dramatically. The damage was military, financial, and psychological. Families with land on both sides of the Channel faced confiscation. Some chose the French king, others remained loyal to John and lost estates abroad. Every dispossessed noble carried a grievance, a hope of recovery, or both. John himself became obsessed with reversing the disaster. He believed, with reason, that a victorious campaign could restore his honor and authority. But campaigns required ships, soldiers, mercenaries, horses, weapons, supplies, and allies. All of these required money. England would pay for the king's attempt to recover what he had lost. Medieval kings did not govern through modern systems of income tax and national budgets, but they possessed many ways to extract wealth. John inherited royal rights, feudal customs, court fees, revenues from royal lands, payments connected to inheritance, and extraordinary demands associated with war. He also inherited an increasingly effective administrative machine. Records were kept, sheriffs collected money, judges traveled, debts were written down and pursued. In another ruler's hands, this machinery might have strengthened order. Under John, it often appeared to his subjects as a network tightening around them. One of the most resented demands was scutage, a payment made by a baron in place of providing military service. Scutage was not John's invention, but he demanded it repeatedly and at high rates. A lord who did not wish to campaign in France could pay, yet the payment itself became a burden, especially when the campaigns ended in failure. John also used reliefs, the sums heirs paid to take possession of inherited estates. When a great landholder died, the successor could not always enter freely into the family property. The crown might demand money, and an excessive demand could threaten the survival of the estate. Wardships gave the king control over the lands of underage heirs. Marriages of heirs and widows could be influenced or sold. Fines and amercements flowed from royal justice. Forest law restricted the use of vast areas designated for royal hunting and generated further penalties. Each right could be defended as traditional. The anger came from the way John combined, expanded, and enforced them. Imagine a noble family whose head has died. The heir is young. The king takes control of the estate during the child's minority. Revenues disappear into royal hands. The heir's marriage becomes a political commodity. When the child reaches adulthood, a large payment is required before the property can be recovered. Now imagine the family knows that the king dislikes them. Is the process lawful administration or punishment disguised as law? That question lay at the heart of John's crisis. His government did not collapse into chaos. It functioned with frightening energy. Royal officials knew who owed money and how much. Debts could be delayed for favorites and suddenly demanded from enemies. Justice could become negotiation. A man seeking the king's favor might offer payment. A man who resisted could discover that old obligations had been remembered. John's defenders could argue that he was enforcing rights his predecessors had neglected. His enemies could reply that he used those rights without fairness, restraint, or predictable limits. Both arguments contained truth. The conflict was not simply between law and lawlessness. It was about whether the king himself could decide what law meant whenever his interests were involved. John's personal behavior intensified the fear. He was capable of charm, humor, careful administration, and tireless work. He traveled through his kingdom, heard business, and involved himself closely in government. Yet he was also suspicious and vindictive. He demanded hostages from powerful families to guarantee loyalty. In a world where hostage-taking was not unusual, John's treatment of hostages could still appear brutal. The most notorious case involved William de Braose, once a favored baron who had helped John in war. Their relationship collapsed over debt, and perhaps over what the Braose family knew about Arthur of Brittany's disappearance. John pursued William relentlessly. William's wife, Matilda, and their eldest son were captured. Later accounts state that they were starved to death in captivity. The precise details come through sources shaped by hostility, but the story spread because it matched what people already feared about the king. A ruler who could destroy a great family could destroy any family. Noble resentment was not yet a united movement. Some barons profited from John's favor, some feared rebellion more than royal abuse, others hoped to recover continental lands through his campaigns. But year after year, the king's demands accumulated. A payment that might have been tolerated once became intolerable when repeated. A harsh judgment that could have been dismissed as an isolated act became evidence of a pattern. John was raising money to recover Normandy, yet each attempt made England harder to govern. His subjects were financing a war designed to restore his authority, and the methods used to finance it were destroying that authority from within. Money was not John's only conflict. In 1205, the death of Hubert Walter, Archbishop of Canterbury, opened a struggle over who had the right to fill England's most important church office. The monks of Canterbury made one choice. John favored another candidate. Pope Innocent III rejected both and supported Stephen Langton, a respected scholar and churchman. John refused to accept Langton. To a modern observer, the dispute might resemble a political argument over an appointment, but in the 13th century, it touched the deepest questions of authority. Was the English church subject to the king, to its own institutions, or to the pope? Could a foreign spiritual ruler impose an archbishop against the will of England's monarch? John saw Langton's appointment as an invasion of royal rights. Innocent saw John's resistance as defiance of the church. In 1208, the pope placed England under an interdict. Public religious life was severely restricted. Church bells fell silent in many places. Marriages might take place at church doors rather than inside. The dead could be buried without the usual ceremonies. The full practical impact varied, but the symbolism was overwhelming. An entire kingdom was being spiritually punished because of its king. John responded not by surrendering, but by seizing church property and revenues and pressuring clergy. In 1209, the Pope excommunicated him. To be cut off from the church was not merely embarrassing. It could release subjects from moral obligations, invite enemies to act, and cast doubt on salvation itself. Yet John survived. He used the wealth taken from the church to strengthen his finances. He governed without immediate collapse. He showed once again that he could turn a crisis into an instrument of control. But the conflict isolated him and added spiritual fear to political resentment. Then, in 1213, John changed course dramatically. Facing the possibility of a French invasion supported by papal authority, he submitted to Innocent. He accepted Stephen Langton and surrendered his kingdoms to the Pope, receiving them back as a papal vassal in return for annual tribute. To critics, this was humiliation. To John, it was strategy. The Pope, who had threatened him, became his protector. An attack on John could now be presented as an attack on a ruler under papal guardianship. John had transformed a dangerous enemy into the highest international authority supporting his crown. The alliance would later help him attack Magna Carta itself. Yet it also brought Stephen Langton into the center of English politics. Langton had ideas about kingship, law, and the obligations of rulers. He knew earlier royal charters, including the coronation charter issued by Henry I in 1100, which had promised to restrain certain abuses. Such documents offered the barons a language of restoration rather than revolution. They could claim they were not inventing new rights. They were asking the king to honor ancient liberties and lawful customs. John, meanwhile, believed the time had come for one decisive campaign in France. If he won, his debts and demands might be justified. If he restored his territories, wavering barons might return to obedience. If he failed, every grievance in England would become more dangerous. By 1214, John had assembled a broad strategy against Philip II. He would campaign from the southwest, while Allied forces attacked from the northeast. The coalition included the German Emperor Otto IV, the Count of Flanders, and other princes threatened by French power. John crossed to the continent and initially made progress. He advanced through Poitou and captured positions. But alliances built from separate ambitions are difficult to coordinate. Some local nobles resisted. John's forces withdrew after a confrontation near La Roche-aux-Moines. The greater disaster came far to the north at Bouvines on July 27, 1214. John was not personally commanding at the center of that battle, but his political future depended on its outcome. Bouvines became one of the defining battles of medieval Europe. The Allied army faced Philip's forces on open ground. Knights formed beneath banners carrying the symbols of princes and counties. Infantry packed close together. Horses, armored men, spears, and shields collided in heat, dust, and confusion. Medieval battles were not clean lines moving like pieces on a board. They were storms of noise, fear, personal combat, broken formations, and sudden reversals. Philip himself was dragged from his horse and nearly killed. For a moment, the fate of France appeared uncertain. Then the French recovered. The Allied forces broke. Important commanders were captured. Otto fled. Philip emerged not merely victorious, but strengthened in prestige. For John, the defeat was catastrophic. Years of taxation, preparation, negotiation, and pressure had produced no recovery of Normandy. The Great Alliance had failed. The subjects who had paid for war saw no triumph, no restored estates, and no reason to believe another demand would bring a different result. The defeat shattered more than a military plan. It shattered the fear that had kept John's opponents divided. A victorious king could punish resistance. A king returning from failure, dependent on money and distrusted by much of the nobility, could be challenged. John came back to England determined to preserve authority. The barons came to a different conclusion. If they waited, he would tax them again, take hostages again, manipulate justice again, and perhaps destroy them one by one. Their grievances needed to become a program. Their private anger needed to become collective action. The question was no longer whether John had governed harshly. The question was whether the king could be forced to govern under rules he had not chosen. The opposition did not rise all at once, and it did not unite every noble in England. Many barons remained loyal to John, whether from principle, interest, fear, or personal connection. Some had benefited from his rule. Some believed rebellion against an anointed king was a greater danger than abusive government. Others distrusted the northern lords, who became prominent among the rebels. But the king's enemies now possessed what they had previously lacked, a shared language of complaint and a moment of opportunity. During the winter of 1214 and the opening months of 1215, meetings were held, oaths were discussed, and old promises were examined. But the king's enemies now possessed what they had previously lacked, a shared language of complaint and a moment of opportunity. During the winter of 1214 and the opening months of 1215, meetings were held, oaths were discussed, and old promises were examined. The Charter of Henry I became important because it offered historical authority. More than a century earlier, Henry had issued a coronation charter promising to correct certain royal abuses involving inheritance, wardship, marriage, and the church. The barons could point to it and say that kings had already recognized limits. They were not, in their own view, inventing rebellion. They were demanding the restoration of lawful custom. Stephen Langton may have helped bring attention to the earlier charter, although the precise development of the baronial program cannot be reduced to one man. What mattered was that scattered grievances were being transformed into written demands. John attempted negotiation while preparing for conflict. He took the cross, placing himself under the spiritual protection associated with a crusader. He sought papal support. He ordered castles strengthened and recruited mercenaries. The barons also armed themselves. In January 1215, they presented demands to the king. John asked for time, promising an answer after Easter. Delay was a familiar royal tactic. It allowed him to gather resources and test whether the opposition would fracture. Instead, resistance hardened. In April, the dissatisfied barons assembled in arms. On May 5th, they formally renounced their allegiance. This was an extraordinary step. Feudal loyalty was not a casual arrangement. To withdraw homage from the king was to declare that he had broken the obligations that bound lord and vassal. From John's perspective, it was treason. From the rebels' perspective, it was justified resistance to a ruler who had violated law and custom. They chose Robert Fitzwalter as a military leader and gave him the grand title Marshal of the Army of God and Holy Church. The language was not modest. It framed their cause as moral as well as political. Yet titles alone could not defeat a king. The rebels needed a center of power. They failed to take Northampton Castle and did not immediately gain universal support. For a time, John may have believed their movement could be contained. Then, London changed everything. On May 17th, supporters within the city opened the gates to the rebel barons. London was wealthy, populous, strategically placed, and politically influential. It provided money, supplies, workshops, communication, and legitimacy. Its streets and walls gave the rebels a secure base near the heart of royal government. A rebellion holding only distant castles might be isolated. A rebellion holding London could threaten the kingdom. The capital's defection also revealed how far John's authority had weakened beyond the aristocracy. Merchants and citizens had their own concerns about taxation, trade, urban liberties, and royal interference. They were not identical to baronial grievances, but they could overlap. With London lost, John could no longer rely on a quick display of force. Both sides moved toward negotiation because both sides understood the cost of full war. The king still had castles, loyal barons, experienced commanders, money, and access to mercenaries. The rebels controlled London and fielded armed forces, but their unity was fragile. Churchmen worked to prevent bloodshed. The location selected for the meeting was Runnymede, a meadow near the Thames between Windsor, where the king had a powerful castle, and the road toward rebel-held London. It was close enough to royal strength that John could attend without appearing helpless, yet open and accessible enough that the barons could approach without walking into a trap. On June 10th, negotiations began. For 5 tense days, demands were argued, revised, translated into legal language, and tied to methods of enforcement. The king, who had spent years turning law into an instrument of royal will, now faced men determined to turn law against him. Runnymede in June would have appeared green and ordinary from a distance. The river moved past reeds and low ground. Birds called above the water. But the meadow was filled with the machinery of medieval power. Horses stamped near lines of tents. Men in mail and padded armor waited under the colors of their lords. Servants carried food, messages, weapons, bedding, and bundles of documents. Clerks worked with ink that stained their fingers. Bishops and senior churchmen traveled between men who regarded one another as enemies. The negotiations did not take place as a single dramatic conversation in which John sat at a table and reluctantly signed a completed document. They unfolded through councils, messengers, drafts, and pressure. The barons presented articles describing what they wanted. Royal advisors examined the demands. Legal experts sought language that could be accepted, or at least understood by both sides. John's loyalists included some of the most capable figures in the kingdom, among them William Marshal, Earl of Pembroke, an elderly knight of legendary reputation whose experience stretched across several reigns. William was loyal to the crown, but loyalty did not require blindness. He understood that the king's survival might depend on compromise. Stephen Langton and other churchmen attempted mediation. They did not all support every rebel demand, but they recognized that the political order was close to breaking. John faced a terrible calculation. If he refused, the rebels might advance, more nobles might join them, and London would remain lost. If he agreed, he would accept limits that struck at the habits and dignity of his kingship. Perhaps he believed he could consent now and escape later. Perhaps he trusted papal authority to release him. Perhaps he expected the barons to quarrel among themselves. John was not a man surrendering his principles. He was a tactician buying time. On June 15th, the terms were accepted in a form that would become the Charter. The document was written in Latin on parchment. John did not take a pen and sign his name. Medieval royal documents were authenticated by seal. Wax bearing the king's image and authority was attached, turning words on animal skin into an official act of government. Copies were prepared to be distributed through the kingdom, likely sent to cathedrals and important centers, so that the agreement could be proclaimed and preserved. The object itself was impressive, but not magical. A dense block of Latin script, thousands of words fitted tightly onto a large sheet. Its power depended on people believing the promises and enforcing them. On June 19th, formal peace was announced. The rebels renewed homage. London was supposed to be returned. The crisis appeared to have ended, yet everyone at Runnymede understood the deeper problem. John had made promises before. Why should these promises be different? The barons therefore demanded not merely rules, but a mechanism capable of acting against the king. This requirement transformed the charter from a statement of liberties into a direct challenge to royal authority. A group of 25 barons would be chosen to ensure that the terms were observed. If the king or his officials violated the agreement and failed to correct the wrong after being notified, the 25 could seize castles, lands, and possessions until justice was restored, while preserving the safety of the king and his immediate family. In effect, resistance to the king could become lawful under specified conditions. To John, this must have seemed intolerable. The charter did not merely advise him to govern well, it created an organized committee of opponents authorized to make war upon his property. The seal may have been attached, but the peace contained the structure of the next rebellion. As royal and baronial parties withdrew from the meadow, the Great Charter entered the world not as a triumphant constitution, but as an agreement neither side truly trusted. What, then, had John been forced to promise? Magna Carta contained 63 clauses in its original 1215 form, though medieval scribes did not number them as modern editions do. Many dealt with technical feudal problems that would seem distant to later generations. Yet behind the technical language were lives, estates, marriages, debts, punishments, and fears. The charter began by declaring that the English church should be free and possess its rights undiminished. This reflected the recent conflict over Canterbury and the broader question of royal interference. John had fought the papacy, seized church income, and pressured clergy. The clause did not create modern religious freedom, but it placed a boundary around one institution's relationship with the crown. Other provisions addressed inheritance. An heir should not be ruined by an arbitrary relief before taking possession of family land. If the heir was underage, the guardian should preserve rather than destroy the estate. When the heir came of age, the inheritance should be returned without an abuse of payment. These clauses mattered because control of land was the foundation of aristocratic wealth and identity. A king who manipulated inheritance could reshape the political class. The charter also addressed widows. A widow should receive her marriage portion and inheritance without unnecessary delay, and she should not be forced to remarry against her will, although the king's consent could still matter in certain circumstances. These were limited protections within a deeply patriarchal society, not a declaration of equality. Yet they responded to specific ways royal power and feudal custom could make women's property and marriages tools of political profit. Debts received attention. If a man died owing money to Jewish lenders, rules would protect the inheritance from some forms of accumulating interest, while the heir was underage. These clauses emerged from a society in which Jewish communities were both economically important and vulnerable to royal exploitation and popular hostility. Magna Carta did not end that vulnerability. Its treatment of debt reflected the interests and prejudices of Christian landholders. Towns and trade also appeared. London was promised its ancient liberties and free customs, and other cities, boroughs, towns, and ports were to enjoy theirs. Merchants were to be able to enter, leave, remain, and travel for trade, subject to conditions in wartime. Standard measures of wine, ale, grain, and cloth were specified, an attempt to create predictability in commerce. Rivers were to be cleared of certain fish weirs that obstructed navigation. These provisions show that the charter was not concerned only with armored barons. It touched merchants, citizens, shipping, markets, and the daily movement of goods. Royal officials were restricted. Sheriffs, constables, coroners, and other servants of the crown could not use office without limits. No sheriff or royal officer was to take horses, carts, wood, or other resources without payment or consent under specified conditions. Officials who did not know the law or did not intend to observe it should not be appointed as justices or local administrators. For people far from the royal court, the king was experienced through these officers. A harsh sheriff could make royal government feel like occupation. A corrupt official could sell favor, impose penalties, or seize supplies. Limiting the king required limiting the hands through which he acted. The charter also addressed taxation and consultation. Certain extraordinary payments, including scutage and aids beyond traditional occasions, were not to be imposed without the common council of the realm. The method of obtaining counsel was still aristocratic. Archbishops, bishops, abbots, earls, and greater barons would receive individual summons, while other tenants-in-chief would be summoned collectively through sheriffs. This was not a modern parliament elected by the population. Yet the connection between extraordinary taxation and consent would grow in importance. A principle was emerging. The king's need for money could require political consultation. John had demanded revenue to fight wars. The barons now insisted that some demands could not simply descend from the crown. The most famous provisions concerned justice. One declared that no free man should be arrested, imprisoned, dispossessed, outlawed, exiled, or destroyed, except by the lawful judgment of his equals or by the law of the land. Another promised that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed. These words would echo through centuries, but in 1215 their reach was limited. A free man did not mean every human being. A large portion of England's population consisted of unfree peasants whose protections were not equal to those of nobles and free tenants. Women possessed restricted legal and political power. The Charter did not abolish social hierarchy, royal courts, imprisonment, or harsh punishment. It did not create trial by jury in the modern sense. Still, the language mattered. John's opponents feared that he could seize land, imprison enemies, and manipulate legal process according to personal anger. They demanded lawful procedure. Punishment should not rest solely on the king's will. Justice should not be a product sold to the highest bidder or withheld from those who lacked favor. The Charter also ordered the removal of certain foreign mercenaries and officials who had become symbols of John's reliance on outsiders. It promised the restoration of lands, castles, liberties, and rights taken without lawful judgment. It addressed forests, counties, bridges, debts, hostages, and the customs of Wales and Scotland. Not every clause expressed a timeless principle. Some were immediate settlements for particular disputes. Some protected elite power. Some were politically impossible. The security clause, authorizing 25 barons to compel obedience, was especially explosive. Yet three truths can stand together. Magna Carta was designed primarily by privileged men defending their own world. It responded to genuine abuses that extended beyond a small circle, and it placed into formal language the idea that royal government could be measured against law. The barons did not set out to create democracy. They wanted protection. But words written for one generation can acquire meanings their authors never imagined. The peace made at Runnymede began to fail almost immediately. The barons distrusted John and hesitated to surrender London until the Charter's promises were being kept. John viewed their continued occupation of the city as proof that they had not returned to obedience. Disputes arose over castles, officials, lands, and the selection of the 25 enforcers. The Charter had attempted to end a political crisis by giving each side obligations, but each obligation depended on confidence that did not exist. John now turned to the advantage he had created 2 years earlier, his relationship with Pope Innocent III. Because John had surrendered England and Ireland to the papacy and received them back as a vassal, the Pope could regard a tax on his authority as a tax on papal rights. John sent messengers and arguments to Rome. He presented the Charter as an agreement forced upon an anointed king by armed rebels. From Innocent's perspective, the barons had humiliated a ruler under papal protection and had created an enforcement system that threatened the divinely ordered structure of kingship. In August 1215, the Pope issued a bull condemning Magna Carta. He declared it unlawful, unjust, harmful to royal rights, and imposed through fear and violence. He attempted to annul it completely. A document that later generations would treat as almost sacred had survived only a matter of weeks before the most powerful churchmen in Western Christianity ordered it erased. For John, the annulment was a release. He had never embraced the Charter as a moral conversion. Now he possessed spiritual authority for rejecting it. For the rebels, the papal decision confirmed their worst suspicion. There was no agreement John would not escape if given the opportunity. Negotiation gave way to war. The First Barons' War spread through England. John drew upon loyal nobles, royal castles, and mercenary soldiers, including experienced fighters from the continent. His armies moved with speed and brutality against rebel lands. Castles were besieged. Estates were burned or seized. Communities lying in the path of armies paid the price through destroyed crops, stolen animals, forced labor, and fear. The barons had challenged a king but lacked a universally accepted replacement. Their solution carried enormous risk. They invited Prince Louis, son of Philip II of France, to claim the English throne through the rights of his wife, Blanche of Castile, who was a granddaughter of Henry II. A rebellion that had begun in the name of English liberties, now called in a French prince. This apparent contradiction reveals the desperation of the conflict. The rebels did not believe John could be bound by charter, so they sought to remove him. Louis landed in England in May 1216 and was welcomed in London. Although he was never crowned, many barons gave him homage. For the first time since the Norman conquest, the English crown seemed likely to pass to an invading French dynasty. John was still dangerous. He campaigned across the kingdom, recovering some positions and punishing enemies. His energy had not deserted him, but his health and fortune were failing. In October 1216, while traveling through eastern England, John crossed the tidal estuary known as the Wash. According to famous tradition, part of his baggage train, perhaps including treasure and royal regalia, was lost in the dangerous waters and mud. The story grew over time, and its details remain uncertain. But it became a fitting symbol for a king remembered for losing almost everything he had inherited. Soon afterward, John became seriously ill, probably from dysentery. He reached Newark Castle, where his condition worsened. On the night of October 18th, or in the early hours of October 19th, 1216, King John died. He was about 49 years old. England remained divided. London supported Louis. Rebel armies and royal armies still held the field. Magna Carta had been annulled. By every immediate measure, the peace of Runnymede had failed. Yet John's death changed the political world in an instant. His heir, Henry, was only 9 years old. The child had not imposed the taxes, seized the hostages, lost Normandy, quarreled with the church, or broken the charter. Royal government could now separate the crown from the dead king's reputation. John had spent his final year trying to destroy Magna Carta. His death created the conditions that allowed it to survive. The men who defended the young Henry III understood that military force alone would not save his throne. William Marshal, now in his 70s, became regent and one of the central figures in the royal cause. Few men possessed greater prestige. He had served Henry II, Richard, and John. He was famous as a knight, experienced in war, and respected even by enemies. Yet his greatest service would not come from a tournament or a cavalry charge. It came from recognizing that the rebels needed a reason to abandon Prince Louis. In November 1216, the government reissued Magna Carta in Henry's name. Some of the most controversial clauses were removed, including the security mechanism of the 25 barons. Other provisions were shortened or postponed for later consideration. The new charter was not a surrender by the child king. It was a political offer: return to loyalty and receive lawful government under a ruler unburdened by his father's broken promises. The strategy weakened the rebel cause. Fighting continued, and William Marshal personally helped lead royal forces to victory at Lincoln in May 1217. Later that year, a French fleet bringing reinforcements was defeated off Sandwich. Louis's position collapsed. A settlement allowed him to leave England, and many former rebels were restored. Magna Carta was reissued again in 1217. At the same time, provisions dealing with royal forests were separated into another document, the Charter of the Forest. This charter mattered deeply to ordinary free people because royal forest law covered hunting, grazing, wood, and access to resources across large areas. The name Magna Carta, meaning Great Charter, came to distinguish the main document from the shorter Forest Charter. In 1225, when Henry III was older, a revised version was issued in exchange for a grant of taxation. This connection was crucial. The king received money, while the political community received a renewed confirmation of liberties. The charter was no longer merely the memory of a humiliating confrontation at Runnymede. It was becoming part of the normal bargaining relationship between crown and subjects. In 1297, Henry's son Edward I confirmed Magna Carta, and it entered the body of statute law. The original 63-clause document of 1215 did not remain unchanged. Much of it became obsolete. Some clauses were repealed. Only a small part survives in law today. Yet the charter's historical power did not depend on every technical rule remaining active. It depended on the story people learned to tell about it. Medieval lawyers cited it. Kings confirmed it. Parliaments demanded that it be observed. Subjects complained that officials violated it. Each repetition strengthened its status. Over time, clauses originally written to protect free men in a feudal society were interpreted as expressions of broader legal principles. The promise that justice would not be sold, denied, or delayed could be used against corruption. The requirement of lawful judgment could be connected to due process. The restrictions on extraordinary taxation could support claims that rulers needed consent. Later generations often read their own hopes into the parchment. That did not mean the history was meaningless. It meant the charter became a living political symbol because its language was flexible, enough to travel beyond the world that produced it. Centuries after John's death, English lawyers and parliamentarians returned to Magna Carta during new conflicts over royal power. Sir Edward Coke, writing in the 17th century, treated it as evidence of ancient liberties and used it in arguments against the Stuart kings. The Petition of Right in 1628 drew upon the tradition that imprisonment and taxation required lawful authority. During the struggles that led to civil war, trial, and the execution of Charles I, Magna Carta formed part of a much larger constitutional debate about whether the monarch governed under law. Across the Atlantic, English colonists carried claims of inherited rights into North America. The language and legend of Magna Carta influenced colonial charters, revolutionary arguments, and later legal traditions. Its impact can be traced in ideas associated with due process, lawful judgment, and limits on government, though no single modern constitution can be treated as a simple copy of the medieval charter. The document also became global in symbolic reach. It was invoked in discussions of liberty and human rights far beyond England, even when those discussions concerned rights much broader than anything the barons of 1215 had intended. This later reputation created myths. One myth says Magna Carta established democracy in a single day. It did not. England remained ruled by a hereditary monarch and a small elite. Most people had no vote, no voice in national policy, and no equality before law in the modern sense. Another myth says the charter immediately protected every individual. It did not. Its language reflected social rank, feudal relationships, and the interests of free landholders. Unfree peasants, who formed a large part of the population, were not granted universal liberty. Women's rights remained severely restricted. Jewish communities continued to face exploitation and persecution. A third myth says John willingly founded constitutional government. He did not. He accepted the settlement under pressure, appealed against it, obtained its annulment, and fought a civil war rather than submit. A fourth myth says the original charter governed continuously from 1215 onward. In reality, the first version failed almost at once. Its survival came through revision, reissue, political compromise, and reinterpretation. These corrections do not diminish Magna Carta. They make its story more remarkable. A document created to solve a specific conflict survived because later people repeatedly found uses for it. Its authors defended privilege, but they also confronted abuse. They did not imagine modern equality, but they expressed distrust of arbitrary punishment. They did not create elected democracy, but they strengthened the relationship between taxation and consent. They failed to make peace in 1215, but they gave later generations a powerful question to ask every government: by what law do you exercise power? John himself remains difficult to judge. Medieval chroniclers, many of them churchmen who had reason to dislike him, portrayed him as cruel, greedy, treacherous, irreligious, and cowardly. Later legends transformed him into the villainous King of Robin Hood stories, oppressing England while noble Richard, the Lionheart, was absent. Modern historians have shown that this image is too simple. Richard spent little time in England and demanded enormous resources for crusade and war. John was not administratively incompetent. He worked hard, traveled constantly, maintained detailed government, understood legal procedure, and sometimes made effective strategic decisions. His fleet and preparations helped prevent invasion. His submission to the Pope was humiliating in appearance, but clever in political effect. He could be generous to followers and energetic in defense of his kingdom. Yet the case against him cannot be dismissed as mere propaganda. He repeatedly failed to build trust. He treated political relationships as tools to be manipulated rather than bonds that required mutual confidence. He could enforce debts and obligations without accepting comparable restraint upon himself. His treatment of enemies appeared personal and frightening. The disappearance of Arthur, the destruction of the Browse family, the use of hostages, the pressure placed on heirs and widows, and the repeated financial demands created an atmosphere in which lawful government seemed indistinguishable from royal revenge. His military failures made the costs impossible to justify. Above all, John misunderstood the nature of durable authority. He believed power could be preserved through control, calculation, money, castles, mercenaries, and fear. Those instruments could compel obedience for a time. They could not create loyalty when subjects believed the king's word had no value. At Runnymede, John's enemies did not simply accuse him of making bad decisions. They accused him of destroying the trust that allowed kingship to function. The charter was their attempt to replace personal trust with written obligation. That is why the enforcement clause mattered so much. They were not satisfied with another royal promise. They wanted consequences. John recognized the danger more clearly than many later admirers of Magna Carta. He understood that if subjects could define limits, judge violations, and organize resistance, kingship had changed. He fought against that change, and in the short term he nearly succeeded. The Pope annulled the charter. War resumed. The rebels invited a foreign prince. John died with the kingdom in chaos. But the struggle did not end where he expected. The monarchy survived by accepting a revised version of the document he hated. His son's government used restraint as a weapon stronger than vengeance. Magna Carta outlived John because it helped restore the authority that John's conduct had damaged. More than 800 years after the meadow at Runnymede, the surviving copies of the 1215 charter are treated as treasures. Visitors look through glass at faded Latin letters on darkened parchment. The original seals have not all survived, and the document's appearance may seem modest beside the enormous reputation attached to it. Yet the object carries the marks of a moment when political power was forced into words. It reminds us that constitutional history rarely begins with perfect heroes or pure motives. The barons were not champions of universal freedom. John was not a monster without ability. Stephen Langton was not the single author of Democracy. William Marshall did not preserve the charter out of modern liberal belief. Every participant acted within the assumptions, privileges, fears, and ambitions of medieval society. What emerged was limited, unstable, and compromised. But history often advances through imperfect agreements. Magna Carta mattered because it made a claim that could be repeated. The ruler and the ruler's servants were answerable to law. The meaning of that claim expanded slowly, unevenly, and through further conflict. It did not prevent later kings from abusing power. It did not end imprisonment without justice. It did not stop civil wars, persecution, conquest, or inequality. A piece of parchment cannot enforce itself. Law lives only when institutions, communities, and individuals insist that it be observed. The Charter's first test ended in failure because neither side trusted the other, and because the king rejected the limits imposed upon him. Its longer life began when political leaders realized that authority could be strengthened, not merely weakened, by recognized rules. John entered Runnymede, carrying the full dignity of the crown. He left with his seal attached to a document that challenged the way he governed. He believed the document could be cancelled, and legally, for a time, it was. He believed the rebellion could be crushed, and militarily, he fought with determination. He believed royal authority belonged to him by inheritance, anointing, and force. Yet his death proved that the crown was larger than the man who wore it, while the survival of Magna Carta proved that law could become larger than the intentions of those who wrote it. King John did not create freedom. He did not accept that he was morally beneath the law. He was compelled to acknowledge limits because his own failures had united powerful enemies. Still, the confrontation mattered. In that wet meadow beside the Thames, government was presented not as whatever a ruler could command, but as power constrained by obligation. The first agreement collapsed. The war continued. The king died. The charter returned. That is the central irony of John's life. The prince called Lackland gained a vast inheritance and lost much of it. The king who used law as a weapon was defeated by a legal promise. The ruler who tried to destroy Magna Carta became forever attached to its fame, and the document designed to protect a narrow medieval elite became a symbol for a principle far greater than any person at Runnymede could have foreseen. No government is lawful merely because it is powerful, and no ruler, however crowned, feared, or divinely favored, can safely stand forever above the law.